Pathology in Tears, those of us like our spirituality with a twist, made it through that time.
You did. Wonderful. Excellent, Eric. It's only taken you several years and you're doing such a good job now.
I get that like little thing that you're gonna like slightly mess with me ahead of time and I'll just screw it up.
Oh, I thought about it actually.
I can tell. All right, anyways. Hey fellow Tears, those who like our spirituality with a twist. All right, so we're back. We're talking about Jung's answer to Job. And if you didn't hear the first one in this, real quick thing is that Jung wrote this long thing where he's talking about the book of Job. We went through the story of Job, which is Satan bets God that they can torture this guy Job to the point where Job will reject God. And God says no to Satan, like Job will never reject me. And he doesn't, but he is irritated by all of this torturing that goes on. And the big twist in Jung is he says what happens in that moment is it's the first moment where both humanity and God have to realize that human beings are superior morally, ethically, psychologically to the divinity. A twist. Spirituality with a twist. Definitely a twist. So Daniel and I talked about that last week, and even to the point where Jung says the reason why there was a figure like Jesus, why that was such an important figure, was not to like forgive people of their sins, but to forgive so that God could be forgiven for the sins against people. So anyways, we talked about it. And by the end of the episode, it's one of those things you hear these ideas and you're like, huh, what, huh? So I bounced it off some people, during the week, as we like to do with the things that we're talking about. Friend of the show, Justin Key, Lake Forest College professor. And I got to the end of it, Daniel, and he was like, what? Huh? What? Because no one's heard anything like this. Mm-hmm. And then you and I talked a little bit that you were telling it to people too. So we thought we'd give a little bit of people's reactions of what people said. So I guess I'll throw you the mic and figure out what people said when you told them the story.
Yeah, I was talking with a friend of mine who shall remain nameless, but who is also a cousin. But, friends can be cousins too, So there's been a little bit of a resurgence in my family of the younger generation kind of being more active in the church, my cohort, if you will, which is interesting, And so, we were talking about all kinds of stuff and this came up. So I was telling him about this particular episode and this particular story, and his eyebrows were plastered to the apex of his skull for sure. When I told him, and I said, well, what do you think about that? And he said, well, sometimes I think people be saying things just to be saying them to get a reaction out of other people. And I said, that's fair. But he also has no idea who Carl Jung was.
Yeah, I don't see Jung as doing that. He doesn't need to make a name for himself by getting some extra clicks on, YouTube or something.
Nah, he doesn't.
His Patreon page or something.
Yeah, no, he doesn't need any more subscribers to his YouTube channel. He
was 70-something years old when he was writing this too. So he wasn't he was writing it as a reflection towards the end of his life, not like to, get some momentum going for an early life career. Yeah.
But the deeper, it opened up a deeper discussion for us actually. And I had said to him that it's sometimes less about the particular take and more about the intention of the take. And I said, for me, I believe one of the intentions of this take was to flip the narrative in order to kind of crack people's minds open on aspects of the story that were absolutely taken for granted and moved on before. And case in point, I sent a message to somebody just today who knows the Bible very well. And I said, do you know the story of Job? And the answer was, lost everything, patience like none other. And I said, well, we're doing these episodes on Job, which really are not about, I said, yes, that's the perspective of Job from an outside perspective. But
that's the interpretation, I guess, right?
Yeah.
It's been given.
Right. Yeah. But that's relating to Job and Job only. Because from many, at least from what I got out of that message, that numerous aspects of these stories are only about the characters within the story, not about the overarching characters who are part of it. So not only are we not looking at the major players, the marionettes, or the puppeteers, not just the marionettes, right? Is that your the intention behind these things is to change your mind, right? That's mainly that's the bigger part. That's the, to me, for me, that's the biggest takeaway. And having this conversation with my cousin and seeing this from my friend here, it just hit me that, like, I don't think people are doing that very much with some of these things that are foundational to our culture, to the minds of people just in general. There's so many things that are taken, I'm not going to say for granted, but are taken, put into the equation, and then just continued on as if, you know, they're there and that's how it is. But we're just trying to do more of that. And I love moments like this when that is, other people are doing the same thing.
So it was like, it feeds into exactly like kind of my experiments with this too, because I went out and tried to do what I would think of as being the G and T of this, which you get other people's opinions, you bounce this off of people, you see how people respond, right?
Yeah.
In an experiential and spiritual kind of a way. And so it gets into the idea of, like, I think what you're talking about, what would be conventional truths from a Buddhist point of view.
Yeah.
Things that are so close that you just assume them, right? And certainly Tantric Buddhism, which is kind of like our home base, at least part of our home base for sure, right?
Yeah.
Ask this question. So I asked some folks about this too, from a different point of view. I know a lot of people from like the former Soviet Union, people who were raised in a completely secular society, and even people who are Jewish, and that their Jewish identity meant something because that culture was so anti-Semitic. And so they would sort of identify, sometimes maybe even, it was a big deal to even like walk past the synagogue or something. People saw you go in, you might be in trouble, So, because of that, they don't have any connection to Jewish identity. Some of them, some people are Jewish, some people not, but, I asked, and one of the responses I got was, oh yeah, that God's a psychopath. That God's just a lunatic. And I thought, well, that's such an interesting answer. These are secular people, didn't know the book of Job. You tell the book of Job and they're like, what? And on the one hand, it's a pretty natural response, especially when you get to the point where you're like, oh yeah, I killed all your kids, but don't worry, I gave you new ones. Don't worry about those old ones. I gave you these new ones. And people are like, what? And so it just rolled off the tongue so easy. And I thought that's an amazing statement about conventional truth, because if you're raised in a culture that has more of that religiosity, knows the right answer, which is patience. That's what you're supposed to, patience, loyalty, faithfulness. That's what the interpretation is supposed to be, right? So if you're raised in a culture where that's natural, well, then, you're going to give that answer or expect that answer. Even if you're a non-religious person, you'll know that's what the answer is supposed to be. Right. But if you don't share that conventional truth, it's really easy for someone else to look at that and go, yeah, that Old Testament God's a complete lunatic psychopath, and that's not an incorrect interpretation either.
Right.
So I told my son the story, and he hasn't been raised in this religiosity either. I was raised Catholic, we were raised in a religious setting like this. And my son's reaction was very immediate too. He's like, oh, God's a dick. And I was like, yeah, certainly you could say that. And he was kind of like, wait a minute, he makes a bet on this nothing just to then just fucks with this guy, ruins him just for like a bet. What a dick. And I was like, I know what to tell you, but it's a very natural reaction. It gets to this kind of thing of like, to my mind, I think it gets to the idea of like conventional truth, right? When you're outside of a belief system, it all looks pretty different,
right,
than for the folks who are more within it, who sort of already know the rules of what you're supposed to say. I think even for Justin Keat, friend of the show, very thoughtful guy. I mean, he's the one who knows what the answer is supposed to be. He's not a religious person,
right?
But he knows what the answer is supposed to be, right? Because you're raised in the context of understanding what it's supposed to be. But so I just think that that's like kind of a fascinating experiment in that when you see people who are not in the setting, they don't know what the rules are supposed to be of this. They don't know what the interpretation is supposed to be. They just have gut level reactions, and there they are, and they're not in the framework of maybe the people you're talking about who are more religious, or even Justin, who's not religious, but at least knows what the answer is supposed to be, right? So I think it's again, that's the conventional truth idea, right? So, pops up not infrequently in our little podcast, but it is one of the really important ideas,
Right.
think of certainly the Tantra, Zen, Taoism, this whole idea of like, wait a minute, what are these conventional truths? And then you look at them, and I throw it out to you because it's the other big thing that got to me. And we talked about this in the first episode with this too, but I think that's seems to be a major part of Jung's point too. I think he wants to do what you're talking about. He wants to challenge these things that go unchallenged, like what you were saying earlier, Daniel, and he wants to turn things upside down. He's a Gnostic minded dude too. And then we've done podcast episodes on Gnosticism. You flip the script, you turn everything upside down. So he's flipping it upside down on people, just like turning doing the magic trick, turn the glass of water over and like make the water not fall out, make the wine not fall out or something. Intellectual magic. But I think that's, like what he's trying to do, which is why I think it's a conversation worth having. Because I'm always coming back to the idea, like, if you're not a religious person and you hear an episode like this, you might be like, this has nothing to do with me. I don't care about some God that I don't think exists. Right. And I don't care, like, okay, it might be kind of a clever thing theologically or whatever, but this is a God that I don't think is anything. And so why should I care about a discussion like this? But I think the thing that Jung is really driving at, even underneath all the conversation about theology and so on, is because these are still like the roots of the culture, right? Even for those people who aren't religious, this is still the underlying cultural framework. And he's like basically saying, okay, it's not just a question of, whether or not you believe in this particular religiosity some way or another. I'm doing a little multitasking here because I got to pull something out for a little bit further up the road, but it's also this idea of, because we're still living in this culture that streams out of these sources, it's still a part of everybody's life, even if you don't think that you care about this theology or this God or this commentary or whatever it is. You know what I'm saying? So we agree on that too, I suppose, right, Daniel?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Yeah. So this is why I think no matter who you are, this is worthwhile thinking about, even for the non-religious, because these things are still going on. And Jung is trying to hit this point, right?
Yeah.
And then in that sense, I think the psychoanalysis of God, what he's doing here is a psychoanalysis of the culture producing that version of divinity, right?
Yeah.
And I could say for myself now, I don't believe in that version of divinity anymore. I don't have an issue with other people do, like your friend and cousin and so on. I'll make our own existential choices around this. But I mean, it's still a relevant conversation because of that idea that it's still like the deeper trends, that are happening.
Right.
Within the psychology, anthropology, is like we were talking about earlier, of the culture. It's still going on this way. So, and you get more you want to say about that before I push it a little bit forward?
No, I think just one piece. Not only is it the sort of like influential building blocks of society, but it's also the influential building blocks of the people who raised you.
Yeah. Which came from the society through into your parents and the people in the community and so on.
Yeah. So I just wanted to add that, sort of ancestral, distinction. Right.
Oh, that part too.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like it goes, some of these things now that may not seem so prevalent, right? Like religious or religiosity type discussions. You say like you're bringing up, oh yeah, what's the point of this? I don't pay attention to these things, right? You might not. That's true. You as the listener, I'm not saying you, Eric, but you as a listener might not. But I'm pretty sure your parents did. And they raised you. And their parents did. And their parents did. And they raised them. And they raised them. And therefore, all those things have come forward to influence the way that our parents raised us. And I'm speaking now for myself and the listener. That like some of these things are so innate that you don't even know to question them because you never felt like the need to previously.
Like they're in the culture everywhere.
Yeah.
They're just around.
They're just around.
And once you start it's that question of because we're obviously big on the pushing the questioning.
Yeah.
But once you start questioning, you get to the point of like, oh yeah, this stuff is everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Even though I think it's gone. Like I don't think of myself as a religious person. But people still act under these ideas.
Yeah.
Even like we were talking last time, Jean-Paul Sartre's observation, like the culture now is you just took out the God, but you left everything else the same, kind of, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe in a more complicated way. So, okay, that was the next big thing I wanted to throw out, which is like, this is still like Yahweh's culture.
Sure.
In some ways. I'm curious your reaction to this stuff too, Daniel. So in a certain sense, these are still like Yahweh's rules. And Yahweh's rules are pretty tough rules.
Yeah.
Yahweh is not fucking around. You can say it. And in a way, and this is really interesting, is like Yahweh is like Saturn too. And I think Jung gets this, though he never explicitly says this. But Yahweh is like Saturn. I was talking with somebody close to my heart, and I was saying it was interested in astrology. And I said, hey, I'd done this answer to the Job, and I just said, what astrological figure do you see the Old Testament divinity as? And then, the person was just like, Saturn. It's like completely obvious. You know? And I was like, yeah, it's Saturn, and I'll explain a little bit about the Saturnness of it, but yeah.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that because I have heard that also, and not from you. I heard that from a friend of mine who is of Kabbalistic influence,
Okay, yeah.
And he said the same, and I don't know how it came up, but it did, and that was what he thought as well.
So, okay, so I brought a little quote because I went into one of my old astrological books just to kind of think about this. I grabbed it over here. The astrological Saturn has always been associated with the letter of the law rather than the spirit. So it's about the law, right? The Gnostics and early Kabbalists identified Saturn with the God of the Old Testament, who they regarded as a tyrannical father, obsessed with the rigid enforcement of the law. And indeed, there may be a very ancient symbolic link between Saturn and Yahweh, for Yahweh's Sabbath or holy day is Saturday, Saturn's day. So I just went into there's a kind of a very interesting book. It's called, Mythic Astrology, I think. I got sitting over here, but I won't bother holding it up to the camera. But anyways, Mythic Astrology, and I just went to their chapter on Saturn, and it just the quote just popped out. And I must have read the book in the past, but you read so many things, you take so much in that particular little snippet, sits there, and I just hit it again right away. And I was like, yeah, that's exactly the thought I was having. And there it was. So, but it's okay. So your Kabbalist representative was thinking that way too. Yeah. So this is, and if you don't know anything about Saturn as a mythic figure, and people may not, obviously we're doing Jung, so you're going to talk about archetypes and myths and all that stuff. Saturn is an asshole. And this is actually going synchronistic in my life too, because I actually went to a bookstore, not this weekend, but the weekend before, and I stumbled across this book in the philosophy section, which is just called Assholes, a Theory. I got to read that book, and maybe we'll do a podcast episode on that. Assholes,
hopefully it's not stinky.
I think it's gonna be a stinky subject matter because those people are difficult. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah. But anyways, Saturn's a dick for sure, per my son's comment. And so, one of the real famous stories is that he's eating his own children. He castrated his own father with a sickle, the sky god Uranus. And then because he's afraid of his own sons then, because he was such an asshat, that he actually won't let any of his children live. He devours them, and Jupiter escapes by his mom, I think, disguises a rock as a baby, puts a little bonnet on her. I don't know what that would even look like. But Saturn devours the rock, thinking he devoured his child, and then it turns out that Jupiter escapes and then turns around and exacts the vengeance back again. But it's a demented story. But it touches something about this archetype. It's an oppressive archetype, they're talking about the tyrannical father, caring about the letter of the law rather than the spirit. If you know any astrology, and we have done a lot of astrology stuff, it'd be fun to do it. So probably future episodes.
Yeah, for sure.
Still we actually haven't done anything on the Kabbalah, really. It's amazing. We've gone 3 years with nothing. All in the docket of things to talk about. But in astrology, Saturn's called the greater malefic. And it's the idea when Saturn gets involved in the chart or gets involved in triggering people and all that, it's to the negative, right? And sometimes you hear this thing about the Saturn return, if you ever heard that phrase. where Saturn gets back to where you were at the time you were born. It's usually around like when you're 28 years old, and give or take. And
Yeah.
it's supposed to be this really unpleasant period of your life where Saturn starts like putting the kibosh on you again. So it's like kind of has this reputation as being this really unpleasant thing. And in a certain sense, then it's a source of like constriction and limitation and walls and disconnection and oppression and bleh, you know. So I think part of the point Jung is trying to make is that, like, yeah, if you look at these stories, they're coming out of this cultural stream, and we're still living in the flow of that stream, like down the road from it. And a lot of it is these senses of like restriction and walls and disconnection and all of this kind of stuff, repression and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he mentions it in different ways in Answer to Job, but he does talk about, like, there's a famous thing in Genesis on the second day of creation where it's the one day God said isn't good. There's nothing good about the day. And it's the day where he creates division. He divides the heavens and the earth. He divides things. It's the day of separation, the day of division, the day of restriction, the day of border, boundary, wall. And it's Saturn. It's the not good day. You know? So if you look through Genesis, it's one of those funny little things, but it's commented on all over the place. If you get into the Kabbalah and you get into other, Jung is doing it too. He's obviously read the Kabbalists, you know, and they're like, oh yeah, that's the day that isn't good. That's the day of restriction. That's the day of like restraint. That's the day of division. It's not good. So, so especially it's, force of limitation, all this other kind of stuff. And so there's an element of the culture. I think part of what Jung is getting to ultimately is there's an element of the culture we're living in, which is Saturnian, right? And you live lives where there's just a lot of restriction, right? And so there you go. I wanted to get your opinion on this, though, in a kind of interesting way, because the other experiment I did was with my daughter, right? So I thought I'd see what your impression was. So, you know, my daughter she's in Paris. She's studying at the Sorbonne for the semester, and she's having a ball, right? And one of the things she had to read that we talked about when she was reading it a little bit was Nietzsche, the German philosopher. And she's reading a lot of heady stuff, right? And I think it's an interesting time for her because she's reading a lot of heady stuff in a way that maybe she hadn't when she was younger, you know? And she's like committed. She's like doing the readings and she's trying really hard, you know, and she's learning a lot. So she read this thing called The Birth of Tragedy. And in this book, Nietzsche talks a lot about Dionysian versus Apollonian. And Dionysian is like sort of more the free, expressive, whatever, somewhat chaotic potentially, right? That would be its bad side. But, you know, the freedom aspect of things. And then the Apollonian, which is order, but also can be like structure that's repressive and so on, right? It's kind of yin and yang. So when we were talking, I was like, yeah, this is yin and yang, right? Like these are these opposites. And Jung is fascinated by these things too. And he knows Nietzsche for sure.
Yes.
Right? He's read him and he knows all this stuff and he talks about it. So this is after, you know, these Greek gods, right? But I was looking at my daughter and I talked with her on the phone during the week and I was like, you know, your life is completely Dionysian. Because she has like no restrictions almost. I mean, she does her schoolwork, but, you know, she's living in this time period where, you know, she's in France, she's living in Paris, she's super happy. On the weekends, she goes to Prague, she goes to London, she's in Florence out at some vineyard out in the country, you know, she was in Amsterdam, you know, and I was like, your life is completely Dionysian. And she's an incredibly happy human. We had this deal that we were going to do shrooms together. That was one of our things we were supposed to do, you know, and we had a nice person who gave us shrooms, but we didn't do them when we were supposed to.
Yeah.
Yes. But to be done. But, you know, she was with friends in Amsterdam. So she did these shrooms, but she did, I don't know the details of this, Daniel. It was some other, like, I guess she was saying it's something, I don't know, some other version of the plant or something that's more mild. You might understand this more than I do because your understandings of these things are much better than mine. But she did something that was a more mild thing. And then you know, she was like with a couple of other friends who I met when I was in France, and they were laying in a field. And she was saying, you know, I felt all the connection to nature and it was really cool.
Mm-hmm.
And her friends are always saying about her, and this is a repeating thing about my daughter, where they all say, you should have like something inside of you that's like, that is like, more like your internal baggage,
Mm.
or, your inner troubles and traumas. And, you have more depth to you. You're not just what's we see. There's more inside of you. We just have to like get through to find like your inner core experiences that are more your traumas and dark sides and whatever. And Lena's always like, no, those things don't exist. It's really funny. And I'm always like, yeah, they don't. There's nothing in there. She's just like an incredibly happy human who is enjoying her life in a very Sagittarian, freewheeling, experiential way. That's fine. And so she did the shrooms, and they were laying there. And I think later on her friend said that, they were talking, and Lena was like, there's nothing else here to see. I'm on the shrooms. There's nothing else coming out. This is just me. And her friend was like, oh my God, I think I believe you now. You're just a happy Dionysian person. And I was like, so we were talking about it, and she was laughing because it was her friend finally agreed, like, okay, I have to accept it now. This is who you are.
Yeah.
So, her life is like Dionysian. It's freedom, it's travel, it's experience, And we were talking, and I said, I think this is why you're approaching the life the way you are, because underneath the surface, you're getting that this life is going to turn Apollonian as fuck later on. This life is going to turn Saturnian, not just Apollonian. It's going to go Saturn, and you don't want to do it. And she was like, I think there might be something to that, because she keeps like, I'm going to keep preserving my freedom. I'm going to keep preserving my freedom. I'm going to keep preserving my autonomy. She keeps doing this over and over again. And it's all the time because I'm just a happy person. And I don't want to get to that point where the job becomes Saturnian.
Right.
Or the relationship becomes Saturnian. Like, she doesn't want to do those things because she kind of sees it that way, So she's living this Dionysian part of life, which I think people can when they're younger. I think they can kind of do culture in their 20s. They can live Dionysian, but then bang, all of a sudden it's the old Yahweh rules kick in. The Saturn rules kick in. I think Leans gets this. My daughter, Alina, she picks up on this. We call her Beans because she came out like a little bean. So I think Beans gets this, she was like a little baby, like a little bean. And, we were talking about it, and she's like, yeah, there probably is something to that, because, she's very at a distance, even with her relationships with, men and things. She's a heterosexual cis girl. And she's very like, nope, I don't want to be weighed down by any of these fucking dudes. No, don't want to be weighed down by them. They're just going to like make things a drag. And it's interesting because she'll occasionally talk with me about this, and she'll say, yeah, so-and-so had this big drama with this guy, and it's ruining their blah, blah, blah. She's watching this on all her friends. And she's kind of she's a fascinating human. I really appreciate her. And sometimes I talk to her and I'm like, you have this quality in you. I don't have that as much as you do. She's like, yeah, this is who I am. I don't carry these other things. But anyways, it's partially about her, but partially also just about the culture. I think it can be Dionysian up to a point, and then bang, it goes Saturn. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. I mean, the question is that a product of external life or a product of our choices? And when I say that, I mean, as we get older, we are taught or shown that increase in accumulation of things is part of being successful. And therefore, as my teacher Andre would say, the more you own things, the more your things own you. And I think that responsibility of owning things and things owning you, including relationships, people, right? Responsibility, financial responsibilities, pets, all this other kind of stuff.
Professional and career responsibilities, right?
All of that. Yeah. Rent or mortgage or whatever, as a means of survival on one hand, or as a means of, I think, on maybe a more evolved expression of living, as like a creative outlet for yourself, even if it's still business, but you're creatively doing that. That's inherent in those choices as well. So I think like you can certainly kick the can down the road, which is a lot of time what college ends up being, right? Is you try to stay in that state of openness, but to your point, then there sometimes can be chaos that is in there as well. That is, I guess maybe emblematic of the youth. What do they say, that the youth is wasted on the young, right? But simultaneously, that doesn't always give you the type vehicle through which you get to express your Shen through in this lifetime in a certain way. But then on the other hand, if you are so tightly bound to a particular lane that you cannot express yourself because that's just a pinhole, of living, that it becomes repressive. And then that kind of like your daughter's friend was saying, well, where's your repressed stuff? Where's the resentment?
Where's all the other layers inside of you where you have this, whatever, this other psychological stuff inside?
Yeah. Right? Where's the stuff that you're stuffing down? Where is the place of repression? How have you been existing on the same plane that I have and not be repressed as I have, And it's a question because I think people are looking to resonate with other people that feel the same way. That's why if you're from somewhere and you meet somebody from that same place, you might feel an instant kind of kinship or something. We're always looking to build bonds, to connect with people, to say, oh, you were there. So even though I'm having my own experience and you're having your own experience, if we experience the same thing, then maybe we have some similarities between us because we have that together. And that might not be the case, actually, And so I said, I think there's an internal part of this that I think is a facet of growing older and wanting to express yourself via professional means. But then there's also, like, as you grow older and you lose the support of the community. And when I mean community, I mean maybe more family, the money means for which you can survive in life. You lose that as you go older. And so then you have to replace that obviously with your own financial means. And then therefore you step into that kind of Saturnian confines of society's druthers, if you will, because because I don't know yet. And this is something I'm also working on. I don't know yet how to be in that aspect of the game and not be part of the game at the same time. But that's, I guess, maybe, what we're trying to discuss here, right? Is how do you be involved without being involved to that level in which you feel like you are compromising yourself to do the things that you need to do.
I suppose if there wasn't any way of not living in Yahweh Saturn's world, this podcast would make no sense.
Yes.
I talk about it.
Yeah.
You're just fucked. But like, I think the reason to talk about it is you're not, it has a lot to do with like, okay, yeah. I mean, I'm going to give my own 2 cents on it, right? I definitely have that Taoisty vibe that like comes up all the time, which is like, yeah, this is going to go very constrictive.
Mm-hmm.
Like there are very, very confined expectations of like we did all the thing on relationships, what the relationships are supposed to look like, what the work is supposed to look like, what the family is supposed to look like, where you're supposed to live, and so on and so on and so on and so on.
Mm-hmm.
It's very defined. And I think deep down, everybody kind of knows this. People know what these rules are. I think they're very like internalized, right? I think, the Yahweh Saturnian rules are there. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It was very interesting because I had a friend whose daughter was like, well, these are the rules. You go through and you sow your wild oats and you're Dionysian, and then that stops. And then, then your life becomes like this. And she was just reiterating this as like a teenager. And I talked with my friend and I was like, well, this is amazing because she obviously has internalized this code, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is the code. It's even a different code because maybe as a teenage girl, you wouldn't be able to sow your wild oats and live wild. Now you can be Dionysian. My daughter can do this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Progress, right? Before you couldn't do this. So
no, you could not.
This is better already. But, I think you can sniff ahead and say, oh, I know where this story is supposed to go now because my daughter's internalized these rules too. This is my Dionysian time. And then bang, it stops.
Yes.
My Saturnian time. Now it's all about like the restriction and the confinement and the taking on the responsibilities and the roles and the so on, right? Which are like, actually, they're Yahweh's. They're the old ones.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And once you get that, then like your life is not that different probably from like my mom's.
Right.
you work, you have your nuclear family, and you do your thing,
Yeah.
and that's it. And that's the old rules. So I could see that tension in my daughter's life, and it was a kind of interesting having the Nietzsche language. I mean, that's a very kind of gin and tantra thing for me. I could go like, yeah, you've read this book now. So now we can look at this and have this conversation. See Dionysian versus Apollonia in this. How does that feel to you? And you can see, she's it's interesting to see what she'll think about that going forward. But she was kind of like, yeah, I could sense what you're talking about. And I don't want to have to be in that Saturnian place. So what do I do about it?
Mm-hmm.
So it is true that a lot of her thought processes are like, okay, I'm going to escape to England for 2 years. And then I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. And she's like, you could say it's forestalling, but it's actually kind of interesting. It's not exactly even it's not obvious what the forestalling is, it's what she really is. It seems like she's optimizing her freedoms for the longest possible time that she can, because she doesn't want to be in Saturn world.
Well, and I think
it's not a fun amusement park.
I think many people
it's a Saturn world after all. That's a depressing fucking ride.
But I mean, I think many people try and do this, and actually, like, looking at it from a slightly different viewpoint from myself, anytime that I have a patient who's a younger kind of teenage person, I always encourage them to take a gap year after high school.
Mm-hmm.
Because to that point, like, you're going to be an adult for far longer than you're going to be anything else in your life. And when I mean adult, I mean, like, household owning, maybe not home ownership, but like apartment or roommates, but like being responsible for paying your own rent and your own food and all the things. What's the harm? What's the harm in taking a little bit of extra time to develop into that being while still having the openness and creativity and a little bit of chaos at that same time? I mean, forever, if you do it for too long, I think you end up losing the ability to take on the responsibility that you need to. You become stunted. And I say that because there are many people in my life who are this way, because they were not reined in at all. And so now it's like impossible to do
Apollonian or something if you're going to be Nietzsche about it.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I mean, on the other hand, like, why dive into it so immediately?
Problem I see in that, Daniel, is what if you're going to go into Saturn's world, what is the gap year even doing for you? I think you have to figure out a way to get the fuck out of Saturn world.
I agree, but at least it gives people something. It gives them
the time to have perspective to figure out what you think that means.
Yeah. And then you provide. I think people have to be provided with the opportunity to choose something different from their experience. And if all you are doing is being stacked up from one boxcar,
you're talking about like, if you're talking about like teenagers being raised in the States, a lot of times in like maybe a suburban setting or something, you're not having a lot of experience of the world. You need to go out. I hear exactly what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
I understand that encouragement a little bit better now. You need to go out and like see some other places, do some other things, have a little bit of an
life
experience of getting out,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like your own life, not the life that was chosen for you.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? And
you mentioned that I think you mentioned it one other time, at least in the podcast this came up. Yeah, but I get it in the context of what you're talking about.
Yeah, and for people like this who are might be influential on the culture in some way, shape, or form later, like, why not? Literally, what is the rush? I understand life is short. We should but like, does that mean that you need to immediately go from your high school directly into a 4-year university where you're going to take a bunch of shitty classes and drink a lot of beer or something like that? Like,
well, I mean, for Lena, she's having the ball. This has actually been quite good.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because there's a kind of a little bit of a balance in her. If I just look at her as like a little mini case study, right? She's in a quarter system, but she's taking a lot of times 5 classes because they're free. It's just the way that's set up. You can take any number of classes you want. You just, you're not paying by the class. You're just paying to be there. Right.
I like that.
And so she's just taking whatever she wants to take. And she's doing more than what she has to graduate.
Yeah.
It's kind of an interesting thing. She's not just like, woo at the party, like, like all the time. There's a certain kind of thing that she's building in herself.
Sure.
But I mean, the thing that fascinates me about it, and I don't know where this is going to go for her, but like, if she's sniffing out that the general tendency of the adult life is to be Yahweh Saturnian, she's not wrong. That's correct.
Yeah.
You pegged it. Diagnosis A+. Now you have to look for the cure,
Yeah.
and whatever cure that means for you, you know. But like, yeah, I don't think she's wrong at all. And I think as far as like the Jung thing, that's the importation of the old rules. Those rules are still there.
Mm,
Do we agree with that, or do you have?
absolutely.
Yeah, they're still there underneath the surface. It's going to be very constrictive. Those are Saturn's rules,
Mm-hmm.
right? This is the rules of the game. It's this schedule, this order, this structure, this life, this relation life, this family life, this professional life, this. Boom. That's what it is, right? It's Saturnian. So, anyways, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how that's her own choice of how she figures that out. That's a very conversation we've had. You know, this is your choice to figure it out. I can't tell you how to do that for you. I know how I tried to do it for me. You have to, like, this is something you're going to figure out for your own self.
Mm-hmm.
It was interesting to see that, like, I think she's getting this thing. It's clicking for her. This is what I'm trying to figure out how to, like, get out of in a way. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. But anyways, that's the reason this matters. Whether you're like, well, I don't care about like some theology about some Old Testament book I never read,
Right.
about a God that some people made up that I don't believe in. That's the reason why it still matters. And I think that's like Jung's underlying message of this. He's trying to say, like, this is the culture, right, that you're participating in, which I guess gets us to wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
Another part of this, right? Because we're going to like maybe take the book of Job apart in a couple of different little episodes, and the major figures. First story was kind of Job and Yahweh. Big next figure to show up on the scene for us will be Sophia, right? And if you're cool to go on with it, you ready to talk about Sophia?
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
okay.
So
So with,
I was going to ask you about it.
yeah, so with Jung and Sophia. So I have to say, Daniel, I'm interested to see your reaction. This will be like hopefully ending on another big finish. Another episode with us going, huh? So here's his take. So a more shocking theology from Carl Jung. So Sophia is the goddess of wisdom, like that word Sophia means wisdom, right? And Jung's take is that part of his analysis of Yahweh, his psychological analysis of Yahweh, is that the trouble with Yahweh is cut off from femininity. He's cut off from femininity in multiple ways. He's cut off from femininity because he's not given a divine female counterpart. It's cut off. So there's no goddess to go along with the god. There's no yin yang pairing. There's no Shiva and Shakti, cut off from femininity. So he has no true divine partnership. And he's also cut off from femininity inside of himself. So he's cut off from his own inner world, and the yin yang balance inside of him internally is off. Then some part of his nature is cut off. And Jung, he tends to use this word anima or animus for the internal yin yang parts, the feminine or the masculine parts. You could overplay this, I suppose, but that's his idea, right? And so he's cut off internally as well. And that means he's cut off from Sophia, his natural partner, which means he's cut off from his own wisdom, which means he can't have insight about himself because he's cut off from the parts of him that would be able to show the wisdom. He's psychologically repressed and therefore can't show wisdom, which is why Jung argues he's constantly shocked, surprised, and duped over and over and over again when he's supposed to be omniscient. Why is his omniscience not working? The reason his omniscience is not working is because he's internally splintered and cut off from his own wisdom, and cut off externally and internally. So in that sense, he's walking around like as this psychologically fragmented being, right? Because he has these repression problems. And that's then Jung's argument for why he's always getting like tricked. Why does the serpent come up and trick him like immediately? Because he should be able to see that coming, but he can't. And then he's shocked. Or in the book of Job, why is it that it's so easy for Satan just to like dupe him into this idiotic bet because he doesn't have his own wisdom. He doesn't need, he doesn't need that bet. He shouldn't need it. He's supposed to be fucking omniscient, but he can't see it. Why? Because he's cut off from wisdom. So in part, it's kind of an interesting word game on the word Sophia as wisdom, but it's referencing like that, that correlation between wisdom and femininity and the goddess, right? And it's not an accident then too to say, or it's an interesting point to say that even in the Buddhist tantras, wisdom associated with the feminine energies, right? Masculine energies with bliss, feminine energies with wisdom, and he's cut off from wisdom. He's cut off from like true partnership. He doesn't have female partners to interact with, and then he's cut off internally from his own parts of his psyche that would be able to provide him the wisdom. And so since he's split, he can't see, and he's psychologically blind. How's that for a thing? What do you make out of that?
Yeah, that's a deep one. I mean, so you have a couple things happening there. One, you are viewing the God of the Old Testament as inherently masculine, right? It's a he.
Which it is.
Right. And so, but just so that we're, kind of distinct about that, so you have to.
It's interesting. It's not like the creative force of all. That's not the divinity that Jung is talking about.
Yeah, no.
It's a he.
Yeah, right. They're talking about that being as a he specifically. So that's first. The other part that I'll get to in a second, gambling has certainly been around for a long time, hasn't it? I mean, this book says
it's going on in the heavens.
Yeah, I mean, they're just, this is like
before the fall, there was gambling.
There was gambling, which is, I mean, we like to take different takes on stories. So there's mine right there, gambling is an ever-present.
They were giving odds to the other angels.
I'm wondering.
I want 20 on Job. I'm putting.
Yeah, he's like, I got a minus 550 on this guy off at himself. So, I'll take that action.
People are gambling everywhere on this, right? There's no way he makes it past the boils. I'm throwing in another 20.
Yeah, so I guess DraftKings is far more closer to divinity, than not.
Yeah.
But yeah, so you have that as masculine. So that stands out first. But then also like
that is true though. I mean, that's not a hidden thing. That's a masculine deity. Yeah.
No, yeah, for sure. And they're always referencing as the father. I mean, it's blatant.
Yeah, it's not the Tao.
No,
it's not the Kabbalistic Ein Sof. It's not that. This is a masculine divinity.
No, and what I also described that kind of ubiquitous creative presence to my cousin who was, a little bit more active in the church now. I described it as love. I said, what if I just call that love? We can agree on that, right? That's a universal positive presence of connection, So it's masculine as number one, but then the other part is that like there is an inherent separation within him and therefore within us. And even though like you can make that observation from the fact that he was tricked, the question that the observation or / question that I have is that when is that disunion addressed in terms of a remedy?
In Jung's book?
Yeah, in Jung's book, or just even in like, Jung
is going to have his take. He's going to have his take on this.
Okay,
but anyways, yeah, I don't want to like just make it about Jung. You're asking a bigger question, I suppose.
Yeah, like
Jung's answer would be never. That's the whole problem. It's never. It's like run through the culture. This splitting, you know what I mean?
And so then, I mean, I am sort of brought back to our femininity episodes that we did.
Definitely uses the word patriarchy multiple times in the book.
I mean, that seems to be present. And then if I'm going to go one step further, standing on my own logic, which is probably not logically sound, but whatever, no one's judging.
I'm sure it'll be logically just fine. But okay.
What about the idea that maybe this society is Saturnic? Is that a word?
I go with it. I like it.
Okay.
I went Saturnian, but Saturnic, I like it too.
Yeah, okay. That this society is Saturnian, but that maybe it wasn't always. And then that my own question for my question, does God have a chart?
An astrological chart?
An astrological chart that's influencing, because if you could look at Saturn's attributes and say, geez, that certainly looks like this character from this book. No offense to those people who, take the Old Testament and Yahweh as, absolute divinity. I'm not in any way disparaging your viewpoints. I'm just, for the context of this conversation, using that in that way. Was there a time that maybe before the Old Testament, because the Old Testament, newsflash, ain't that old?
Yeah, it's old, but there's some older stuff.
There is some older stuff, which is I reminded my cousin about. I said, yeah, New Testament's kind of old, but not as old as the Old Testament. And guess what? That's not even that old either in comparison, so like, it's not the new kid on the block. And so then if that's the basis of my argument, like, could society, it would seem to me relatively logical that society might have been influenced by a different planet, or maybe society had attributes that would represent a different planet's persona, if you will, which would then give us a different kind of existence, a more egalitarian or communal existence, which would, give credence to some of the episodes that we did on femininity and how their view, or at least that couple authors' view on society, was way back when, before there were quote unquote sons of man.
There used to be more matriarchal feminine influence in the
mm-hmm.
That was the whole idea of it. I mean, as far as like the astrology of it, like, there's kind of a weird thing in astrology, because Saturn used to be the farthermost planet you could see, right? And as other planets were found in the solar system, it was supposed to be the idea that was challenging aspects of like Saturnianness, right? So when you found Uranus outside of Saturn, then you get revolutions, right? Like the French Revolution or something, or the American Revolution. They're kind of born on the Uranian times. Uranian times. And then you get the Neptunian times as you find that, like, so I think it's interesting. You can kind of talk that way, that there can be like astrological changes that might have influences on how culture would function and think, right?
Hold on. Is Pluto a planet or not anymore? I know it wasn't. The astrological
part of this is kind of interesting, because it was a planet, right? And then that's a planet of power and big business and so on. So that's one of the interpretations of that, right? It's corporate, right? It's power, one of the interpretations. And now that they're taking it off as a planet, now we're like wrestling over what that means. It's a big fight over, are we going to let these big structures, these big hierarchical oppressive structures, like, dominate our world or not? That's one of the big fights, right? And if they do, Pluto, death, destroy the planet, right?
Bring him back. I'll take him.
Yeah, I know, it's interesting. So it's like, it does create, like, what you're saying is like, this is a concept, right? It's funny talking with my son, because we were having these conversations and I was trying to teach him, we have these little artistic conversations. I tried to teach him about music. And so there's a John Lennon song called God. And it goes, the first line of the song goes, God is a concept by which we measure our own pain. It says, say it again. God is a concept by which we measure our own pain. And I played it for my son, because this is a very simple song with this very strong meaning to it. And you can hear how he sings it. And my son was like, oh, that's cool. And my son also thinks of God as a concept, meaning that he thinks it was invented by people, right? At least this God that we're talking about here. And it has a history, right? Yeah. So at some point, I don't know when the exact date would be when someone came up with this divinity to get an actual birth chart of the moment or something. But yeah, it should have a moment, right? A time frame when the alignments were right to come up with this concept. But like, it is certainly true that Saturn was the outermost thing. Saturn was the boundary of everything, like in the solar system. That was the last planet you could see without a telescope in the sky. So
totally,
like, yeah. Oh, God, yeah.
Yeah, totally, kind of like not off topic, but I finished that Brad Warner book, and I'm going to email him so he can come on, because I do like him. He has a song, because apparently John Lennon had a song named God, right? That's the name of the song. And then U2 had a song called God Part 2.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah. And then I finished that book that you got me, about a year ago, from Brad Warner, The Other Side of Nothing, which I don't need to plug his book, but like Brad Warner's a good author, as Zen influenced author, and is good, is worth reading his stuff. He has a song called God Part 3. And I finished the book today. And at the end,
oh, that's really funny. Synchronicity again. Look at that.
yeah,
right?
he was I just happened to like he goes, okay, bonus track. Here's my song with my band called God Part 3, because he said, if you two could do a part 2, I think I'm better than you too. So I might as well do a part 3. So
yeah. Well, this
yeah.
stuff gets invented. So my son, we were talking about, I was like, we were talking about like why it is in school that people like dudes who act like dicks. I was like, yeah, that's part of the culture. It's like chimpanzee behavior or something, the one who tries to get on top of the other dude, and it feels uncomfortable, right? It's like you make yourself like feel better by standing on the head of the other person, kind of, right? It's very typical kind of like
King of the Hill.
grade school boy behavior, but just people can do that anywhere, really.
Yeah.
And then I was going like, it's part of this whole thing, like in the John Lennon song, because once you get the idea that it's a concept, you start going, it's a huge hierarchical concept.
Yes.
God's the biggest dick, using my son's language. And then underneath that, there's the king, and he's an asshole. And then there's the dukes and the lords and the whoever, and they suck. And they're standing on top of you. And then underneath that, till eventually you get someone down on the bottom and everyone's smushing down on them. And it's a hierarchy. And some person invented that. That was painful for me. Like, I realized that over the course of the 3 years of us doing this podcast, where I had to face the truth of that. And it's like, that's a painful realization that that's part of that concept. Yeah. Okay, but wait, there's more about Sophia, so I should finish it before we
finish it. Yeah.
Okay. So now, because our poor Yahweh is cut off internally and externally, he does this thing. This is Jung's interpretation. This will end on a big finish. What he does is, instead, he turns to Israel and he makes Israel his partner, because he doesn't have a partner.
Israel is
like the people that are talked about in the Old Testament, the people of the covenant. He turns to them and he projects his needs for a partner onto this group of people that he's now affiliated with himself with, right? So now they're his partner. They're his feminine partner, right? They're now put in the role of being his wife or something. He's now there. That's his feminine surrogate partner that he's projecting his needs onto. And so then he treats the relationship, then per Jung, what's happening in a lot of this Old Testament kind of stuff is he's then treating Israel like he's a possessive husband. He's a jealous, angry, possessive divinity who's constantly guarding and monitoring the behavior of his spouse. And that's why he's doing it, because he's cut off from the possibility of equal femininity, in equal feminine partnerships. And instead, he projects this thing onto Israel. And that's why he's always in these moods. Because he's quick to jealous rage if she doesn't do what he wants. And so he's monitoring and guarding her behavior. And then that's the psychological problem within God. This jealousy, possessiveness, these outbursts. That's why it's so easy to threaten him. That's why Satan can come up and go, that Job really isn't that loyal. She isn't, and then he's like easy to like trigger. That's his thing. Big finish again to an episode.
I like that, though.
It's interesting. This is another one of these situations where, we did these episodes on Jung and his personal life and all that. And like if you, at the time he was writing this, and he's writing this as an older guy, he's in the 70s, he's already lived out his life, but you can kind of see that the way this looks to me, you could see it now if you know about his own personal life better, like the way we were talking about. He was challenging all of these societal codes, coming up with his own view of the world. And he's a
Yeah.
very challenging person. And you could see like in his personal life, he wound up being sort of a polyamorous person. And so he's like, again, he's fighting these traditional ways of defining things. And then he's doing it here again. He's coming back to this idea like, see, this is people's concepts of what love is, what relationship is. It's not good. You know, it's pathological. It's possessive and it's narrow. And it's there's all of these rules and codes and all these things. And if the person breaks them, then, you know, people are going to be super pissed off, just like their God that they invented. He's doing that actually in this really kind of funny way.
Mm-hmm.
If you know about his life, it's like it reads even clearer.
Yeah.
Almost seems like a testament of like, okay, you know, like this is the problem in the culture all the way up to God, because it's a restrictive, repressive, jealous, rule driven, insecure thing that then acts out in these kind of like jealous rages. And it's like kind of in his writings in these funny ways that, like, again, I hope these episodes make some, for people who are interested in Jung, I hope this like adds something to their understanding of Jung. Because once you know more about his life, you see him a little bit differently. Some of the things pop out at differently to your ear.
Right.
You know, and all of a sudden, like, because he has parts in the Memories, Dreams, Reflections where he'll say like jealousy is really bad. Jealousy is the opposite of love. And he comes out with these things and you're like, they would slide by, you know, in a funny way. But if you kind of know more, I think about his life and what he was working towards, the way he was trying to re-envision a life to be different, where he was obviously trying to like get out of like certain kinds of like cultural understandings of how life had to be. We're talking about his relationship thing now, but he's doing it all over the place, right? Then all of a sudden he reads different. Then you're like, okay, I understand more why he's saying the things he says based on even the simplest understanding of the concepts of his life. He's a different person and a different writer.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's one that like when I've listened, I was telling Justin Key, friend of the show, about like, you know, when you read about Jung, they don't ever talk about his life. You know, like you don't necessarily know this about him, and especially about Book of Job. I was like, he did like a chat GTP. Justin loves that thing. And so he was like, well, let me ask about the Book of Job. And it said some stuff. And I was like, no, that's not the right interpretation, because people don't really talk about him. Honestly, first of all, maybe because it's just too controversial, right? The stuff he says is too edgy. And then when you really get it, you know, and then also like you don't know his life enough, you know, so he's not like it isn't integrated together in the understanding. But anyways, I mean, I hope that like on some level, like if you were interested in Jung, this is a different take.
That's very different. Yeah.
And it's an older guy writing this. I mean, he's like looking it back on the experience of his whole life. He's not a young dude. He's an older guy going, okay, here, let me give you a summary of some stuff that I experienced in my life. I'll share it back. I'll do it as a commentary, right?
Right.
It looks like this book that, you know, whatever, but like, look at it. It's going to say a lot inside of it. It's going to be there. You know, it's if you read between the lines, you're going to see what I'm saying. Because I think, again, for what we were talking about earlier, this could just seem like, well, it's an old biblical book. It's an abstract commentary. It could be clever, but like, who cares? But I think he's talking about something that's more, at least my read on it, it's something more like driven by his own personal experiences, whether they be in his own life or his clinical life or whatever. He's trying to say something about the culture, right? That he's been working with and kind of like in his own sort of probably little battles with in different ways throughout the entirety of his life. And then watching how this is also maybe true in this patient population.
Yeah.
I know. What do you think? It's a shocker for an end.
Yeah, no, I like that. I mean,
it's like really different take again, right? But it has a psychological explanation behind it. It's interesting because he does act like a jealous spouse. He's afraid, you know?
I think, and we don't do this too much as we're recording, but maybe the next episode that we do, Eric, and this would be kind of a teaser for those listeners who are rocking with us all the way to the end here. We could talk about maybe integrating that part. You know, and maybe we could talk about, you know, just from our own sort of experiences, you know, in meditation or via study or books or, you know, whatever. Like, how would somebody consciously integrate the, you know, the wisdom tradition, within themselves? How can someone, or in a grander sense, I don't want to make it be about masculine and feminine because we've done this before, but specifically the wisdom component, like transcending our own ignorances intentionally via wisdom, and how that might look for somebody. How would they go about it? It's like putting this into like practical application. So if the premise of his psychological viewpoint of Yahweh is true, then that would
It's kind
mean
of like
that,
true of the culture, right?
yeah,
This
true
is
of the
God invented
culture.
by the culture. Yeah,
Yeah, true of the culture. Then that means that everybody's influenced by one way or another, either actively
That's fair to say.
or as a byproduct of just its resonance in the life around us, right? Well, then that would mean, at least for me, that for those who want to take a more empowered approach to their life, would consciously do something to reintegrate those pieces that are not currently, or at least that they're not consciously aware of. And so this might be a really nice opportunity for us to kind of, not that we're not being ourselves, but to talk from this perspective of like how we have done this, or some, tangible tips.
I'm definitely being myself here.
Yeah, no, I'm
I might be
saying
being
that.
too much of myself here, but I'm
Yeah.
being myself. What's interesting about that is probably like what jumps out to me too is like kind of like, again, the Buddhist tantras or whatever tantra you like, because you're doing a lot on femininity,
Yeah.
and then that raises that weird, interesting archetypal question. If I spend time meditating on the feminine tantric goddesses, is that a way of tapping into wisdom? Because they're going to make it like, so this is, again, again, there's different tantric traditions and different meditative traditions and so on, but like I do it every day where I meditate in myself in female form.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then like this tradition, the comment is I'm meditating myself in a Sophia form. And then, just archetypally, when you do that, does it change your feeling? You know what I mean? Partially about wisdom, partially about love and compassion too. Right. Because sometimes there's understanding, like if you talk about like Tara as a female figure.
Yeah, let's not go too far. I want to save.
Oh, you want to save it? Okay, you want to save it. Okay, but that might be something worthwhile. But that would be like, that raises that interesting archetypal question when you actually tap into that archetype through that visualization.
Yeah.
Does that start to change your attitude about wisdom?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I mean, we could do it like, so we did Sophia.
Yeah.
Think about that. We could probably integrate this too, because one of the other things to talk about is obviously there's still JC.
Yeah.
In the pipeline to talk about what he means to Jung. And there's a couple of other complication things, but we'll figure it out. We'll talk during the week, if we're closing up shop, because we got to bounce around 10ish when our recording time. It's getting late in the evening for us for recording. Mm-hmm. But if like, that's the idea, I think, we probably could figure out ways of like giving a little shout out to Jung, but also making sure we do the commentary on what that would mean.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, that's essentially what I'm talking about here, is taking it and then doing the commentary on it as we're doing it, because I think it adds, again, because you brought this up from the beginning, right? You're like, oh, I'm not a religious person, or this book doesn't have much meaning for me. Why does this even matter? Why am I listening to this? And like, we're presenting the materials, but then in a very kind of Buddhist way, then they'll do commentary on the materials, which makes the materials more tangible, which we're totally doing as we're giving it. But I think at least one of the things that people have expressed a little bit to me over the years is the desire to like hear how to implement things, like from people who, have taken time and have, been in meditation and, live this kind of life. And so not necessarily looking for like, quote unquote, advice or anything like that, but just some guidance on, because we're always talking about these kinds of things.
Sorry, let me cut you off.
No, and just to make it a little bit even more simplistic. Okay, here's how we view this. Here's how we view this. Here's how we view that. And I think that has a real motivational factor for people to do what it is that we're hoping that they do. I
think it's like interesting about it is like sometimes you can call all of these conversations what they call analytic meditations.
Yeah.
Someone comes along and presents you something to think about.
Mm-hmm.
You go, oh shit, wait a minute, I hadn't thought about like these stories and the way Jung is talking about them. Damn, what do I think that means to me? And you contemplate a little bit. So that would be like an analytic meditation. But then you could also do like other things like visualizations, and that was what we were talking about a little bit, at least, if you get into like Buddhist Tantra, you see yourself in feminine form. Well, that means you're tapping into some archetypal aspect of wisdom or something through that visualization. You know what I mean?
Well, let's talk about it.
Get into it. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, so okay. So end on Jung doesn't let you down. At the end, he's going to say something where you're like, what?
Yeah, that's right.
I never heard that before. So Jung doesn't let you down. So he came through again.
Thank you. Thank you, Uncle Carl.
Way to go, Uncle Carl.
Well, also, thank you, Uncle Eric, as always, my friend. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful as always. I enjoy our discussions here. And thank you to our audience, whether you're number 1 or number 301, I don't know where we are, and I don't count. Some people count, I don't count. I don't even like counting, to be totally honest. But we appreciate all the love. So if you want to hit us up, feel free to leave a comment in the YouTube section, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. If you're checking us out on Apple Podcasts, leave us a review. It definitely helps out the show. And also subscribing does help out the algorithm. So it is in our favor to do that, to get us pop up on other people's feeds, because like you, I feel like our work has benefit to other people, and it would be good for them to see it. And if you want to hit us up on an email, ginandtantra@gmail.com, or feel free to, send us a Instagram message, Gin and Tantra Podcast. We are active. We do check those things. And so, we'll get back to you. If you have some questions, comments, concerns, or just thoughts, we'd be happy to hear from you. We do love it. It's kind of like fuel for our TNT, if you will. So anyways, for Eric, this is Daniel. We'll catch y'all on the next one. Good luck with everything. Peace.